Hi guys, welcome back for part 2 of our series on CPUC Rules 15 and 16. If you recall, in part 1, we covered what these rules apply to. In this video, we'll begin by looking at some exceptions and exclusions, situations where these rules do not apply. Next, we'll cover key requirements that must be met by the applicant before any allowances can be granted by the utility. Then, we'll talk in more detail about facilities installed by the applicant and deeded to the utility. And finally, we'll walk through an example of a residential subdivision that helps illustrate some new concepts. So, while I continue preparing for part 3, Charlie's going to take it away.
Thanks, Jenna. Hi, everyone, and welcome back. If you recall from Part 1, Rules 15 and 16 define the cost sharing for the installation of permanent residential and non-residential electric service. In Part 2, we're going to cover some special or unusual construction situations in which the application of the rules may vary. For example, Rule 15 requires special facilities requested by the applicant to be at the applicant's expense. For example, to connect underground runs of conduit and high-voltage cable, many utilities prefer to use pad-mounted terminator cabinets, similar to the one shown at the left. However, to minimize the visual impact of this type of equipment in new residential neighborhoods, many developers prefer the use of more expensive subsurface vaults, shown at the right. When the vaults are installed in place of the cabinets, the additional expense will be paid by the applicant, and when the facilities are deeded to the utility will credit to the applicant the value of the cabinet pad only, not the value of the vault. This is an example of how the additional expense of special facilities are paid by the applicant. Conversely, betterments are defined as the additional facilities installed by the applicant at the request of the utility. This may include additional substructures, conduits, or other facilities requested by the utility for future use. For example, if it's determined the conduit and vault shown are the facilities required for the applicant's project, but the utility requests additional conduits or larger vaults, the additional cost may be paid by the utility. Relocations or rearrangements of any existing electric facilities at the request of an applicant will be paid by the applicant. For example, if the transformer shown at the left needs to be relocated because of new construction on the applicant's property, all expenses of the relocation will be paid by the applicant. When overhead electric facilities exist and an applicant requests to have the facilities converted to underground, this is an overhead to underground conversion and is not covered under Rules 15 or 16. See CPUC Rule 20 or check with your local utility representative for the construction and cost responsibilities of overhead conversions. Streetlights shall be installed in accordance with the service provisions of the applicable streetlight schedule. Construction of facilities for emergency or insignificant loads are not eligible for allowances. And finally, temporary services are installed in accordance with the fundamental provisions of Rule 15, except all charges and refunds shall be made in accordance with CPUC Rule 13. Check with your local utility representative to determine if your project includes any of these special provisions. Before allowances can be granted by the utility, a few provisions need to be met by the applicant. First, the utility is provided evidence that construction will proceed promptly and financing is adequate, and the applicant has submitted evidence of building permits, home purchase contracts, or lease agreements, or where there is equivalent evidence of occupancy or electric usage satisfactory to the utility. Once these provisions have been met and are satisfactory to the utility, the allowances will be granted and construction can begin. Before we get to the example, let's talk a little more about facilities that are installed by the applicant and those deeded to the utility. If you recall the example from Part 1, let's start with the electric meter panel. This electric enclosure is installed and owned by the applicant. Conversely, the electric meter is always installed and owned by the utility. The service conduits are installed and owned by the applicant. However, the service conductors within the conduits are installed and owned by the utility. The substructures and primary conduits, including the concrete pads on top of which pad-mounted electric facilities are installed, are all installed by the applicant and deeded to the utility. The transformers and high-voltage cable are all installed and owned by the utility. Let's take a look at a residential subdivision. In this type of electric distribution construction, the distribution extension into the subdivision is typically comprised of conduit containing high-voltage conductor and a series of underground vaults connecting the conduit and cable. The conduit, conductor, and vaults are typically installed under new sidewalks that wind their way throughout the subdivision. Electric transformers are typically installed behind the sidewalks and between the homes. Depending on the size of the new homes, a single transformer can provide electric service to about 20 homes. Since the transformers provide electric service to more than one customer, everything installed up to and including the transformer is installed under the provisions of Rule 15. Each of the individual services are then installed under the provisions of Rule 16. Let's do an example. Let's assume a developer wants to build a residential subdivision with 25 new houses. To start the project, the developer hires an applicant designer at a cost of $12,000 to complete the construction plans required for the new development. This period of time is typically referred to as the planning phase. During production of the construction plans, the utility requests some additional facilities to be installed that are not related to the project itself. Located on the property of, but not related to the new electric service of the development, this would be considered a betterment. Once the construction plans were completed and approved, the project advanced to the pre-construction phase. During this period of time, the utility was then able to provide a construction estimate to determine the estimated construction costs, allowances, and credits. They will first determine the estimated value of the substructures to be installed by the applicant for the work related to the subdivision, $34,200. Second, they will determine the additional cost for installation of the betterments requested by the utility, $9,000. And lastly, they will determine the cost of the portion of the work to be completed by the utility, $63,800. The total of $107,000 is what needs to be paid to the utility prior to starting any work. Next, they will determine the applicant's construction allowance. In this case, it would be the fixed residential allowance of $3,250 for each of the 25 new homes, a total allowance of $81,250. Since the developer hired an applicant designer to produce the construction plans at a cost of $12,000, the utility provides a credit for the cost of the plans had the utility performed the work themselves, $9,500. Lastly, they will determine the construction credits for the work to be performed by the applicant. This includes the estimated value of the substructures installed by the applicant for the development, which was already determined to be $34,200. The utility pays the additional cost of the betterments, including the installation, estimated at $9,000. The total estimated value of this work, $43,200, is the applicant installation credit. The final total of $26,950 shows an excess of allowance and credits. Since the total allowance and credits exceeds the amount payable to the utility, the developer will not need to provide a cash advance to the utility. Also, since the project costs are covered by the allowance and credits, the applicant is not eligible to receive any refunds should additional customers connect to the Rule 15 portion of the new distribution system installed by the applicant. Once the costs have been determined, the project can proceed to the construction phase. The applicant hires a construction contractor at a cost of $92,000 to complete the applicant's portion of the work. From Part 1, you'll recall this includes all trenching, backfill, and installation of the conduits and substructures. Once inspected and accepted by the utility, ownership of most of the new facilities is conveyed to the utility. The utility will then complete their portion of the work, including installation of the cable, transformers, meters, and any other equipment necessary to begin providing electric service to the new development. When the construction was completed and the system was energized, the project advanced to the final stage, the cost accounting phase. During this phase, the utility will reconcile the final costs of the project, enter the new assets into their rate base, and begin the process of billing the new customers for the service of providing electricity. While we're here, let's look at the applicant's total investment in the project. The cost of the utility's portion of the construction, $63,800, for which the utility granted an allowance of $81,250. The total cost of the applicant's portion of the construction, $92,000. After the work was inspected and accepted by the utility, a credit of $34,200 was granted for the value of the substructures. The applicant installed the betterments at the request of the utility, $9,000, for which the utility credited the entire amount of $9,000. The applicant also hired an engineering firm to produce the construction plans at a cost of $12,000. The utility credited back $9,500. The value of the construction plans had the utility performed the work themselves. The applicant's total expense, $42,850. Now, let's look at the utility's investment in the project. The allowance granted for each of the 25 new homes, $81,250. Plus the credit provided to the applicant for the substructures, $34,200. They covered the cost of the installation of the betterments, $9,000. And finally, the engineering credit for the applicant-designed construction plans, $9,500. The utility's total investment in the project, $133,950. The cost sharing illustrated in this example includes adjustments for the betterments requested by the utility. Also, the values shown in this or any other example should not be used to determine actual expenses for any similar project.
Thanks, Charlie, and thank you all for joining us for part 2 of our series on CPUC Rules 15 and 16. In this video, we talked about some exceptions and exclusions to the rules that may apply to your project. We also discussed some requirements that need to be met before the utility will grant allowances. We expanded a bit more about the facilities that are installed by the applicant and deeded to the utility. And finally, we showed an example of a residential subdivision that included the addition of betterments and special facilities. We hope you enjoyed this video. Please join us for part 3, where I'll be talking about non-residential projects, separating costs, and more on applying refunds. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and share, and subscribe for more videos like this one.